Yes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jude Olinger. I am CEO of the Olinger Group. Our logo is up here. And we're happy to sponsor this TTRA conference. And I'm happy to introduce this next session. The Olinger Group, my firm, is a market research firm. We study lots of things, but travelers and tourism is one of our specialties, specifically luxury travel and luxury travelers. In fact, we just completed a study of the U.S. luxury travelers, and we're going to be discussing some of the results of that in a session this morning, but I think it overlaps with this. Cruise, luxury cruise, traveling, and sustainability is our topic for that. I have the great pleasure of introducing Mark Holmes, who I just met 10 minutes or so ago from the University of Guelph. Oh, I tried. I'm sorry, Guelph, which I understand to be west of Toronto, about an hour or so. And Mark has got a panel today that he's going to bring up and discuss the topic. Mark's an operations professor at the university, and lots of operations and lots of real world practical experience. He told me, having worked 10 years in the restaurant business. So Mark, come on up, and thank you very much. I hope you guys have a great conference.
So we'll try to run today. I'll kind of get up here between each of the presentations and just introduce the next speaker. We'll hold the questions till the end so we can kind of, if we have time for questions, which I'm hoping we will, we can get to those. So hold your questions till the end and we will get to those. We will follow the same list that we have in the actual course, in the actual schedule. So we'll start with Danielle Robinson of Okanagan College presenting on what is tourism for? Growth, sustainability, and regeneration in the Canadian tourism policy.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm just going to screen share and you can let me know that that is working before I get going. Is that good? Okay, so welcome to people joining virtually and those that are there in person. It sounds like a lot of fun to be in the room. I'm Danielle Robinson. I'm at Okanagan College, which is in British Columbia, about 5 hours east of Vancouver. So I'm really interested in purpose, and it's going to come up a lot. So the research purpose for me is to get a better understanding of how tourism's purpose is conceptualized and then operationalized in policy. Because I think that that kind of consideration is something that's needed in order to have really critical conversations and policy actions and business development that reorient post-COVID tourism towards positive social, economic, and environmental contributions. So that's where I'm starting from, and I think you'll be a pretty receptive audience, because I think given the conference theme and the sessions that we're seeing, we share the sense of purpose. So here are some things tourism could be for, and you'll be familiar with these, but if you look at UNWTO, tourism has that potential to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, those that are focused on inclusive and sustainable economic growth, sustainable consumption and production, and the sustainable use of oceans and marine resources. So that's the sustainable piece. I know there's another concurrent session on sustainability, and we're in the regeneration session. I'm sure they were not sure where to put me because I'm talking about both. So UNESCO uses that idea of regeneration and talks about tourism's potential to regenerate destinations through economic, social, and environmental benefits, and to revitalize human and natural ecosystems. So obviously tourism has great potential. We know this from organizations like UNWTO and UNESCO. We know this through many DMOs, through academic literature, through gray literature. You're familiar with all of this potential that tourism has to be purposeful. Is that evident in tourism policy? So that's the question that I was interested in exploring. And the work that I did uses a framework and is built on the foundation that Torkington, Stanford, and Guyver investigated in their work in 2020. looking at the national tourism policy discourses of 7 European countries. And in that work, they examined the terms growth and sustainability, and in particular, how those apparently incompatible terms, those terms that there's kind of a tension between them, how they're reconciled into tourism policy. So I'm using a similar method, but I'm adding the term regeneration, since that's something that we're seeing more and more frequently in other contexts, in academic ones and in gray literature. I wanted to see if it was reflected in policy at all. So 2 methods. The first, a more quantitative one, a corpus linguistic analysis, looking for frequency, clusters, and collocates of the terms growth, sustainability, and regeneration. So for that, I was using a free online tool, AntConc. The second method looks at the same documents, but with a more qualitative approach, looking at context and doing some interpretation and asking some probing questions about tourism's purpose and how it's reflecting cultural values or power dynamics. So those 2 kind of methods. And then the context of language tells us important things. So this work is situated in a scholarly literature that recognizes that linguistic framing both conveys things about culture and shapes culture, and that cultural values are really at the root of many of our challenges. So it's really important to be looking at culture, and language is a vehicle to access that. So I look at 2 policy documents at the federal level in Canada. And this is preliminary research. So I'll show you what I have with those 2 methods, and I'm interested if there's time at the end for your questions and suggestions. So I'm looking at a 2011 federal strategy, Welcoming the World, and a 2019 strategy, Creating Middle-Class Jobs, a federal tourism growth strategy. And Torkington et al.'s work just was a snapshot in time rather than looking at a longitudinal analysis. And I don't quite have a longitudinal analysis, but I wanted to have 2 comparative pieces. As far as I know, there's no strategy in between, and there isn't a formal strategy since 2019. So the findings so far, I'm going to show you tables that show the quantitative part with the corpus linguistics. And you'll notice when I show you the tables that there are some terms or clusters that I've circled. Those are ones that I'm going to pick up on when I talk about the general patterns and a little bit of comparative observations, looking at the 2 strategic plans and then comparing the Canadian findings to those of the 7 European countries. So word frequencies. If you want to start from the bottom of the table and work your way up, regenerative does not occur at all. So this is in the regenerative session, and it's about how regenerative is missing. It doesn't occur in the policy documents. Sustainable does 7 times. You can see the rate per 1,000 words there as well. But really it's growth. Growth, growing, grows, grow is the theme. And particularly in 2019, partly because the word grow is in the strategy's title, but even when you exclude that, it's definitely emerges as the focus of strategy tourism's purpose. When you look at 2-word clusters, so what goes with grow, and you kind of scan through the list, both for 2011 and 2019, you see an economic discourse in which indicators and rates of growth are really prominent. So fast growing, high growth, ambitious, growth rate, similar sorts of themes. There are fewer 2-word clusters with sustain because I only included clusters that occurred with a frequency more than once, and there just weren't that many with the word sustain. It didn't occur as frequently as growth. So you see some of sustaining growth or sustainable tourism. So you're not, I think in the quantitative analysis, I'm not sure what the sustainable tourism means quite yet. It could mean sustaining tourism, or it could have a more robust definition, but you can see it appears, and you see the circled terms that I'll return to. The collocates of growth, I'm using the same parameters as Torkington et al. In order to compare later on. So just, does this tell us anything new when I kind of expand my search so it might reveal these associations that are non-sequential? And there are a couple there that I've circled that I will pick up again. I was optimistic when I saw pillars as the number one measured by effect size in 2019. Maybe it will be something about pillars of sustainability, social, economic, and environmental, but it's not. When you check the context, it's tourism is a pillar of the Canadian economy. With sustainable, we do see environmental in 2011, and I will speak to that. It doesn't appear in 2019, and you're not getting a lot of new information about what it is that's being sustained. So overall, I'm just kind of giving you a bit of a high-level sense of what the corpus linguistics shows. Tourism's purpose is economic growth. That's the purpose of tourism, and growth really is generally what is being sustained. Although there's some awareness of where that growth happens, or when it happens, or for whom, evident. So I'll give you some examples of those, because I think that tells you something about what's valued and what tourism's purpose is seen as being. So in 2011, you saw Sustain Canada or Sustain Community circled. The purpose of growth is to sustain a community. So that kind of indicates a more ultimate purpose. In 2019, you saw dispersion come up as a key collocate, and that growth in tourism should be dispersed. And that was both geographically and seasonally. So the when and the where of growth, having some indicators for that. Beyond just more and more, and the focus of growth outside major urban centers, outside popular destinations. So they don't use terms like over tourism or carrying capacity, but perhaps that's implied some awareness of wanting to spread out the growth. In particular, rural, which comes up 18 times, and Indigenous tourism, which comes up 33 times in 2019. Neither of those are introduced in 2011. Jobs was another term I'd circled. It's implied in 2011 that the point of the economic growth is creating jobs, but it's very direct in 2019 that the point of this tourism growth, the purpose of tourism growth, is creating these middle-class jobs. Not only is it in the title of the strategy itself, but it's also occurs with almost twice the frequency, even when you admit that. Also, tourism's purpose really seems to be to win. This is language that's entrenched in competitive, growth-oriented kind of battle metaphor. That's not really unusual. Military metaphors and business strategy are pretty common. But it is interesting to reflect on, what we're doing here. And in 2011, we're competing in a world where consumers are bombarded with commercials, and competition's described as fierce and intense. And of course, the competition is constantly growing. Canadian tourism is described as falling behind other countries because they're ramping up their efforts, and this competitive field's getting increasingly crowded. We need to stand out. We need to fight harder. Although I want to give you the end of that sentence that I just started on the previous slide. We are fighting harder in 2019 for our fair share of the international market. And that concept of a fair share comes up several times in that strategic plan in 2019. So what does fair mean? Does it indicate some awareness of equity on a global scale? maybe, some inkling of like sustainable development goals and our commitment to supporting sustainable development. Does fair growth imply that there would be a limit to Canadian growth, that if tourism in Canada grew past a certain point, it would be unfair? So I think there's some questions to ask about that, but this was a shift that potentially could be consequential when we're thinking about the purpose of tourism post-COVID. Does it indicate some kind of shifting cultural value? So that was the optimistic part, but 2019 lost the natural environment entirely. In 2011, we saw the environment. There was a brief definition of sustainable tourism and the consideration of environmental and cultural impact. There was an awareness of environmental purposes, that beyond economic benefits, tourism might promote understanding, encourage respect for the natural environment, and that there were also responsibilities to protect and manage ecosystems, and that idea of preserving for generations to come. So kind of like a Brundtland definition of sustainability into the future for future generations to enjoy. By 2019, none of that is there. The use of environment just comes up once in the context of our matchless environment, but nothing other than that. And climate change doesn't come up at all. So how does Canada compare to Europe? Pretty similar in terms of this growth, economic growth being the purpose. That was a common between the European countries and Canada, with some of the same word clusters. The difference was in sustainability. These highlighted terms are top 10 in Torkington et al.'s European study. They don't even occur at all in the Canadian policy that I looked at. And although Torkington et al. Are critical in terms of this being often just lip service, that the strategic plans they're analyzing don't really engage with the tension between advocating sustainable development and then endorsing continuous growth. But in the Canadian policy documents, it's not a matter of not walking the talk. We're not even doing the talk. It's not even engaging with that language yet. So I'm going to circle back around to where I started as I conclude. Some things tourism could be for: sustainable development, regeneration. Now, when you look at policy documents from 2011, 2019, in a Canadian context, tourism really isn't for those things. Tourism is for sustaining economic growth. And so in this session on regeneration, there's really nothing on regeneration. There's really nothing on sustainable development, although there's some awareness of where, when, for whom this tourism growth is serving, but largely it's detached from those potentials. And then where do we go from here? So obviously our context has changed really significantly. What's happening with policy discourse post-COVID, because this 2019 plan is, that was a different world. Are we moving towards a more purposeful understanding? When we look at what the conference is telling us, it seems like there's so much potential. From the title of the conference to the session names. But there's a public consultation right now in Canada focused on this post-pandemic federal tourism growth strategy. And just like a cursory look at it shows sustainable does not occur, regenerative does not occur, but growth occurs 7 times in 388 words. So, have our values changed? Did COVID change how we approach tourism's purpose? I'm not sure, and perhaps there'll be opportunity to contribute to strategic planning going forward. I'm interested in other people's contexts and questions if we have time for them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. What a great way to kick off a discussion of regenerative tourism and how it fits in the Canadian policy and the comparison between the EU. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. Next up, I'd like to invite Natasha Francis from Ryerson University, Tom Griffin from Ryerson University, and Walter Jamieson from Ryerson University to talk to us about the role of tourism and the visitor economy in Main Street recovery and revitalization.
I'll share my screen. Is that looking okay?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. Okay, so hi everybody. I'm excited to be here. My name is Natasha, and I'm a recent graduate from Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson University. And this presentation is based off of the research that I did for my master's thesis, which I finished in December last year. But it's also been part of a larger ongoing project that's been led by my two co-authors, Dr. Tom Griffin, who's the associate professor within the university, and also the assistant director of the Hospitality and Tourism Research Institute, as well as my thesis supervisor, most importantly. And he's here virtually today as well. And it's also been led by Dr. Walter Jamieson, who has a lot of years of experience of tourism planning in many different countries. And so together we worked on this project that looks at the role of tourism in the visitor economy in Main Street recovery and revitalization. So this is just an outline of some of the topics that I'm going to talk about. And I'll start with a little bit of background literature. So Main Streets are essentially areas of concentrated commercial activity. They serve as gathering spaces within communities, and they often have public spaces, cultural institutions, and amenities, and they're places that people go to work, shop, eat, and gather. And so Main Streets provide a lot of value to local communities from an economic, social, and environmental perspective. So for the economy, they provide a lot of diverse employment opportunities and often have a lot of independent businesses, which help to keep profits within the communities that it's spent in. From a social standpoint, again, they also have public spaces, cultural facilities, and amenities that provide spaces for people in the community to gather and connect. And then for the environment, Main Streets are often high density and they focus on the pedestrian experience as opposed to other forms of transportation like driving. So Main Streets have long been facing challenges, which as a result of the pandemic have been added to and exacerbated. Issues like business vacancies, increasing taxes, competition with online retail, restrictions on gatherings and events, changing purchasing and travel behavior, and social issues. And so given the value that Main Streets provide, it's worth investigating ways to address some of these challenges. And so a business improvement area, or a BIA, is essentially an association of property owners and tenants within a defined geographic boundary that work to improve the business environment and attract visitors to it. And so they're also collective organizations, and they're funded through a mandatory levy that's paid by all of those business and property owners within that boundary. And so in short, a Main Street is the place, and a BIA is the organization that's responsible for managing that place. So the most fundamental and overarching function of a BIA is to improve and promote the business environment. They do this typically through working on 6 main areas, which are beautification, revitalization and maintenance, marketing, events, business recruitment, and communication. And so the literature really talks about how BIAs have been helping to contribute to the renewal of downtowns around the world. They've been shown to help on areas like advocating for the business community, encouraging more people to shop at local businesses, improving property values, expanding the tax base, lowering vacancies, and even helping to reduce crime. And so this idea of BIAs attracting visitors and providing positive experiences is kind of central to their purpose because it's understood that the BIA model combines functions of both urban management and tourism destination management. And so BIAs are really focusing on activities at the Main Street level that many tourism organizations are working on within broader destinations. So looking at things like place management, customer satisfaction, hospitality management, and competitiveness. And so when we think about the idea of a tourist, it's often defined by different criteria like distance traveled, motivation for travel, or time spent away from home. However, the concept of the visitor economy, in contrast, is a lot broader, and it considers the impacts of all visitors to a place, even those that don't necessarily meet those criteria to be defined as a tourist. And so there may be other groups like post-secondary students or commuters or even some day trippers who aren't technically tourists, but who bring similar impacts that are worth understanding. And it's kind of the idea that all tourists are visitors, but not all visitors are tourists. So why did we focus on the visitor economy for this study? I'll try to, okay. So it, again, ensures that these valuable segments aren't being excluded from planning and discourse, but also that main streets as local destinations, a lot of the visitation that they typically experience are from local and regional travelers. And then also through the pandemic, there's been a renewed interest in local experiences. And so it was important for this study to have kind of a broad outlook to make sure that all of these groups were being captured. And so that leads to the research gap, which is that current literature on BIAs acknowledges the importance of tourism for BIAs. However, very few studies to date have actually exclusively explored the topic. And it's important for a few reasons. One being that main streets are local destinations, which then in turn positions BIAs as important actors in local destination development. But then also as a result of the pandemic and as mobility and motivations shift, now may be a good time to examine the benefits that visitors can bring and to understand if visitors can help to address some of the challenges that main streets have been facing. And so the research questions that we were focusing on were, to what extent and in what ways do BIAs engage the visitor economy? Do BIAs see the visitor economy as a strategic approach for Main Street recovery from the impacts of COVID-19? And can BIAs be part of the planning and development of the broader visitor economy within destinations? So I'll briefly talk about the methods. So this was an initial exploratory study. It was qualitative, and we chose to use purposive and snowball sampling strategies to recruit participants. And then we held hour-long semi-structured interviews. The population included representatives of Canadian BIAs and equivalent organizations. And then we did a thematic analysis, and we chose it because of the flexibility it provides to adapt the analysis process to best fit the research, and it helps to produce comprehensive and rich representations in qualitative data. So this is just a summary of the sample. So in total, we spoke to 32 BIAs and did 32 interviews with 36 participants. And that was just because some BIAs brought more than one person to the interview. And as we were recruiting participants, we made an effort to make sure that there was some variation in the sample in terms of province within the country, but also large and small BIAs and urban and rural locations. So I'll talk about some of the main findings. So participants often spoke about the impacts that COVID had on their main street. One of the biggest impacts was changes to visitation, with many main streets noting decreases in visitor groups like tourists, office workers, and students. However, some main streets noticed increases in some visitor groups, particularly local and regional travelers that were looking for experiences through the pandemic that were closer to home. But they also talked about impacts like a canceling of events and festivals, business closures, competition with online retailers, and social issues like homelessness, mental health, addictions. But then there were also some unexpected positive impacts for main streets, as they saw increased engagement from their membership, an increased collaboration with external stakeholders, and also just a general push to support local business. And so in response to some of these impacts, BIAs took on many different roles to try to help their members. So they disseminated information on public health guidelines and government supports. They also pivoted their events and activations, developed their online presence and social media marketing, worked on public realm initiatives, collaborations and partnerships. They advocated for the needs of the business community, and they also provided grants and reimbursements. And so when looking at the views of BIAs towards the visitor economy, all the people that we spoke to believed that visitors did bring benefits to their main street. The main two benefits that were spoke about was the support visitors provide to local businesses and also their contribution to word of mouth marketing. And this was expressed regardless of the volume of visitation that any main street typically would experience. And then in terms of their understandings of visitor activity within the main street, it was often found to be anecdotal and most commonly in reference to traditional tourism, but was less often inclusive of the broader visitor economy. And so while participants had some level of awareness about different visitor segments, like for example, cruise travelers or event and entertainment travelers, these understandings were not often actually reflected in planning and initiatives. However, there was a small minority of BIAs that did this successfully, typically by creating promotions and experiences that were designed to specifically reach identified target markets, which kind of exemplifies this approach for other main streets. And so when looking at BIA's role in the visitor economy, BIAs directly attract visitors, typically by marketing to non-residents through social media, but then also by hosting events, festivals, and activations as a way to provide a motivating reason for visitors to come to the main street. But BIAs were also active in areas like streetscaping and beautification, cleanliness, and safety and security, which, although these activities weren't done with the primary purpose of engaging visitors, they kind of helped to indirectly do this by improving the quality of the main street as a visitor destination. And then when looking at partnerships, many BIAs communicate with their local DMO, but less often was it found that they had active collaborations. However, through the pandemic, these relationships were often strengthened, and it was expressed that this was likely due to the fact that many DMOs shifted their focus to more local markets, which helped to further align their interests with BIAs. And then BIAs also collaborated with neighboring main streets, typically by coordinating their marketing campaigns and working on activations that would span multiple districts. And they did this as a way to coordinate visitor economy engagement in the broader area and work together on visitor initiatives. And so these are just some of the challenges that BIAs expressed that they've faced in the past with engaging visitors. Issues like low budgets, low staffing and time, the seasonality of tourism, issues with destination development, competition, and difficulty collecting quality data. And so when looking to the future of the visitor economy for main streets, there were two main things that participants expressed. One is that the resident population is going to remain a priority moving forward, but that visitors are going to be very important in revitalization efforts as a way to renew vibrancy to main streets, but also that within the visitor group, local visitors in particular are going to be the most important market for the foreseeable future. And this was even expressed by main streets that prior to the pandemic had received significant levels of what you would consider traditional tourism. So I'll talk about some of the implications first for BIAs in main streets. So while most of the people that we spoke to appreciated the value and the opportunity of the visitor economy, there was pretty limited strategic planning for actually harnessing this potential. But there were some examples that are worth noting of BIAs that were able to do this successfully. For example, some partnered with local DMOs to align their marketing and communications. Some planned activations to meet the needs of their identified target markets. And some also collaborated with other main streets on activations that were designed specifically to encourage the movement of local visitors between districts. And so what this suggests is that BIAs can integrate these kind of destination management and marketing practices into their work. Because sometimes it was found that when they did consider visitors, it was kind of grouping visitors into one large homogeneous group, but instead considering different visitor groups with varying motivations, behaviors, and impacts, and then tailoring their offerings to the needs of these groups may be worth considering. And so through the pandemic, as BIAs collaborated more, they found that doing so helped them to pool resources, align messaging, and strengthen the impact of their efforts. And so beyond just immediate pandemic recovery, this also has applications for the longer term planning and development of the broader destination, with the idea that a coordinated approach helps to align development, which can raise the image of the broader destination, which then in turn can benefit the individual main streets. And so it's important to note that this research isn't trying to suggest that BIAs should be prioritizing visitors above residents. However, participants often express that the needs of residents and visitors are often complementary. So having things like an attractive main street, quality retail and restaurants, events and activations, and a safe environment are all important for making the area a nice place to live for residents, but are also central to the district's ability to attract visitors and provide positive experiences. And so it should just be always thought that any attempt at developing the visitor economy should be focused on resident quality of life and well-being as well. And then implications for academics. So it's hopes that this research provides an improved understanding of main streets as destinations and kind of brings to light the relevance of academics focusing on research on tourism and the visitor economy down to the main street level, with the idea that main streets are both local destinations themselves, but they're also pieces that fit together and make up broader destinations. And then finally, this topic of main streets as destinations would be an interesting topic for interdisciplinary research that can bring together different concepts and theories and ideas from a variety of fields like urban planning, local economic development, marketing, leisure and recreation, and tourism. And so it's hoped that now that this study has laid some foundation, now there's room to look at more narrow topics relating to this. So perhaps target marketing, strategic partnerships, main street destination development, or data collection for main streets. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Natasha. It was really great to go from that policies perspective of the first presentation to see more of a grounds approach to how it's being done on a main strip. So thank you very much. Well done. We're going to move now from more the localized connection to a more global perspective, and look with Chloe King's paper looking beyond sustainability, a global study of nature-based solutions in regenerative tourism.
Hello, sorry. Thank you so much, everyone. I pre-recorded this presentation actually. I don't know if there was a link available. The Wi-Fi situation here is.
My name is Chloe King. I am an early.
Oh, there we go. Go ahead. Thank you.
And consultant. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe King. I am an early career researcher and consultant in the exciting world of sustainable tourism. I'm currently the director of conservation and community development with Solomar International, and also an MPhil student at the University of Cambridge, soon to be starting a PhD here in the fall. I will be presenting today on my research titled Climate Action Through Regeneration, Unlocking the Power of Communities and Nature Through Tourism. This has been a year-long collaborative research effort of nature-based solutions in tourism businesses around the world. And I am really excited to finally share the results with you today, which have just been published last week, and you can download at regenerativetravel.com. So today I'll provide an overview and an introduction to this project. I'll talk about nature-based solutions and the regenerative economy shift. I'll discuss my research methods and aims, and then ultimately present the 5 principles that resulted from this research for developing effective nature-based solutions in the tourism sector. So first, I'd like to present and discuss the importance of nature-based solutions and nature generally in combating the climate emergency that we all face. The World Economic Forum published a report in 2020 that said that over half of global GDP, so $44 trillion US, is potentially threatened by a loss of nature and biodiversity. So we're facing an enormous challenge, yet the transition to a nature-positive economy could create 395 million jobs by 2030. But nature is often forgotten in our work to decarbonize and mitigate emissions. We are seeing more and more the interest and investment in nature-based solutions, so actions that protect, sustainably manage, and restore nature while simultaneously addressing societal challenges is soaring. Global investments in nature-based solutions surpassed $133 billion in 2020. The United Nations Environment Program predicts this number is going to have to triple in the next 30 years. 66% of country signatories to the Paris Climate Agreement have also mentioned NBS as part of their strategy, yet only 17 of these have mentioned NBS, the power of NBS for both mitigation and adaptation. And by 2030, nature-based solutions could contribute 30 to 37% of the cost-effective mitigation required to limit warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Examples of nature-based solutions include solutions that protect ecosystems, such as avoided forest conversion or peatland impacts or avoided degradation of coastal wetlands. It can be solutions that manage ecosystems, such as natural forest management or agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, or solutions that restore ecosystems, such as reforestation, coastal wetland restoration, and peatland restoration. However, it's really important to acknowledge that there have been many documented issues and criticisms with nature-based solutions, including proper and carbon accounting, or the use of offsets without actually taking action to reduce emissions, or even unintended societal or environmental impacts on destinations. Thus, this research really seeks to enhance and improve guidance on implementing nature-based solutions for tourism businesses by drawing upon regenerative theory. So what is regenerative theory and why is it important? While I'm sure I don't need to get into this too much because this is the theme of this conference, I want to provide a few important definitions. Regenerative economy principles have been inspired from fields like circular economics to the gift economy. Many of you may have seen Kate Raworth's donut economics model, but this is not a new line of thinking. And in fact, it is very much derived from and aligned with the vast and diverse array of indigenous wisdom that sees humanity as belonging to rather than owning the land. And a regenerative economy renders the health of humans and nature indivisible from one another. Embracing regenerative theory and practice will be key to developing nature-based solutions in the tourism sector so that tourism can be more effectively and equitably contributing to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So what can nature-based solutions mean for regenerative tourism businesses? We know that there's huge potential to have investment in these solutions, but by adopting regenerative thinking, we think that we can improve these generally. And ultimately, regeneration is a process and a mindset shift that places greater value on human well-being than growth and profit through a holistic, place-based, community-led and environment-centered approach. Regenerative tourism embraces living systems thinking that sees all critical aspects of a destination, such as visitors and hosts, economies and ecosystems, as interconnected and underpinned by nature. Businesses can learn to manage tourism like they would nature-based solutions as a complex adaptive system with trade-offs between society, ecosystems, and local economies. So getting into my research methods, I looked at two primary research questions. First, how can nature-based solutions help tourism to be more regenerative? And how have tourism businesses embraced regenerative thinking and living systems thinking in their adoption of nature-based solutions? My ultimate aim with this research was really to come up with a framework that merged these two disciplines and enhancing and ultimately informing how tourism businesses are implementing nature-based solutions in more regenerative ways. First, I took the IUCN Nature-Based Solutions Global Standard and adapted it to a tourism context with 8 criteria and 28 indicators to guide assessment of businesses. I then assessed 30 tourism operators around the world through qualitative interviews and surveys, which then resulted in 5 principles for developing effective nature-based solutions in tourism, which I will now go into. In this section, I will highlight each of the 5 principles in very rapid succession, so apologies in advance, including key actions for tourism businesses and a quote from our case study participants to show how these principles are actually being implemented. For much more detailed information, I invite you to read the full white paper, which is hosted online. So to begin, the first principle is to center community needs first. And to some, it may seem counterintuitive that the first principle for creating nature-based solutions through tourism does not focus on the natural world. But effective conservation and climate initiatives are built on a foundation that acknowledges and embraces local context. So key actions include understanding and documenting societal challenges, prioritizing the most pressing needs for community stakeholders, adopting a living systems approach that recognizes complex interactions between economy, society, and ecosystems within destinations, and documenting changes and trade-offs in human well-being outcomes as a result of these interventions. As Barana Conservancy in Kenya put it, it's very important to move forward together, not just to move forward as a conservancy. The grass should not literally be greener on the other side of the fence. This business was able to address challenges that the communities had in securing access to land and gaining employment opportunities for marginalized groups, ensuring that the destination as a whole benefited from business development. The second principle is to improve ecosystem integrity and biodiversity. This includes monitoring ecosystem changes over time and adapting as needed, viewing tourism as a tool to finance and facilitate ecosystem restoration and protection, and engaging residents, visitors, and employees in ecosystem and biodiversity work through educational opportunities, citizen science, and sharing lessons learned. As Binabura Eco Lodge in Australia put it, our work for the next couple of years won't be so much about restoration of biodiversity. It'll actually be trimming back biodiversity to deal with the realities of climate change and bushfires. So this business recognized that adaptive management was essential to understanding new societal challenges that were arising and that we all are going to face over the course of climate change. The third principle was to embrace diverse and inclusive business models. As we all know, the greater the diversity of a natural ecosystem, the better it withstands external pressures or sudden shocks. A vibrant reef that is home to hundreds of species of fish and coral really bounces back much better than a bleached reef after some catastrophic event. And there's increasing evidence that the diversity of business revenues and business strategies also help during particularly unpredictable shocks and crises like we all saw over the COVID-19 pandemic. But business health and long-term viability is as critical as its foundations in nature and community. And this principle really focuses on the how of implementing nature-based solutions, arguing that diversity is essential to successfully scaling these solutions. So key actions include improving the viability of the business and nature-based solution by diversifying revenue streams, retaining and supporting talent through enhanced training and employment opportunities, and embracing inclusivity and diversity in partnerships, employment, and marketing strategies. As Hamanasi Resort in Belize noted, one of our core values is that we want employees that are so happy and skilled they're able to go anywhere else and work, but they choose to stay with us. Hamanasi took employee well-being to heart at the center of their business model and ultimately provided very diverse training opportunities for marginalized groups and enabled their employment in a variety of jobs, which strengthened their business model as a result. The fourth principle is to develop transparent governance structures accountable to all stakeholders. This means continuously engaging stakeholders and establishing a process for soliciting and incorporating community feedback, respecting and upholding Indigenous and community rights to land and resources, and ensuring that communities have access to vital natural and cultural assets. As Playa Viva in Mexico noted, direct lines of communication have been critical to our continuous coevolution to see where our common values and dreams align. This business appoints a full-time community liaison officer whose full responsibility is to maintain contact and communication with the local community. And they've also opened up spaces that are too often reserved only for the tourists that come there, for a chance to have celebrations and education opportunities with the wider community and wider residents. The fifth principle is to enhance regenerative partnerships. And as our final set of key actions, it's asking for tourism businesses to be a bridge between communities and government to enhance social and ecological regeneration, to partner with NGOs and government to inform management, monitoring, and reporting, realizing that you don't have to do all of this alone, and to contribute to national and global targets for human well-being, climate change, biodiversity, and human rights to scale best practices out and up. As Finca Rosa Blanca in Costa Rica noted, businesses need to be politically involved in order to guide and steer the government in the right direction. And this was a sentiment that I heard countless times throughout this research process, where tourism businesses were not only essential in helping government to gain progress on protecting ecosystems, such as coral reefs or terrestrial forests, but they were also able to help community with healing, with overall a social and cultural healing, where the history of a place might have resulted in extremely challenging relationships between government and community, and tourism businesses help to bring these groups together. So as I said, that was a very rapid overview of the findings of this research and the principles that we came up with to develop these effective nature-based solutions in tourism. And you're welcome to read the full report at regenerativetravel.com. But I just want to end with a final quote from Aldo Leopold, who is the sort of founder of wildlife ecology in the US, who said, "We shall never achieve harmony with land any more than we shall achieve absolute justice or liberty for all people. In these higher aspirations, the important thing is not to achieve, but to strive." And I think for the tourism businesses that we were in this research and for everywhere around the world, I really think that this quote rings true. And sustainability is a process, regeneration is a process, and we ourselves must immerse ourselves into nature's process of healing, not to seek to achieve a final goal of sustainability or regeneration necessarily, but to strive constantly to address the many challenges that we face in each of our destinations. So I thank you to my co-author, O'Shannon Burns, who wrote this report with me, and to our publishing partners, Regenerative Travel and Solomar International, and to our long list of incredible affiliates, especially to the long run, whose many of their members were featured in this research and participated as case study participants. So thank you very much. And I look forward to receiving your questions, and feel free to reach out at any point with any inquiries as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. Great discussion of the 5 strategies we can start using to look more at nature-based solutions at both local but also more regional levels. And lastly, we have with us Emily Yeager to present her paper on assessing demand for the North Carolina Oyster Trail, which she's published along with Carla Barbieri, Jane Harrison, and Whitney Knollenberg from North Carolina State University. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Can I use this? Okay.
Just give me 1 second. It's not shared yet.
Now, is it preferable that I stand at the microphone or?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Yeah, bring it down a little bit.
I like to move around a little bit.
Any videos in your presentation?
No videos. Let's make sure this is working. So. Here we go.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everybody doing? Yeah, thank you for being here. I see some friendly faces in the room and some new faces. I'm really excited to be a part of this session because what I'm going to talk about today is a particular product in North Carolina that really is at the heart of regenerative tourism in a way. And the oyster itself is our product that we're talking about today. So this research is market research that tries to understand who our potential consumers were for the North Carolina Oyster Trail. And as you can see here, I've got my team here in the room, Dr. Whitney Knollenberg and Dr. Jane Harrison, and Dr. Barbieri is actually presenting in another room, but this has been a really fantastic experience. And I do hope that if there's anyone in this room that's interested in any type of trail development that has to do with some type of food product, please talk to us afterwards. We're happy to share this experience with you. So the first thing to talk about is what is the North Carolina Oyster Trail? So many years ago, there was a time when you could not eat the oysters very safely out of North Carolina's waters, or at least there was a perception of that. And oysters, if you're not aware, at least from an ecosystem perspective, are incredibly important to cleaning your waterways, and they also are shoreline stabilizers. So they're incredibly important for our environment in North Carolina, as we are experiencing extreme symptoms of climate change already with more severe storms, shoreline erosion. So protection of this particular species is really important. And also oysters have a socially and culturally significant place in North Carolina's history. It's always been part of the diet of, especially in Coastal Plain and the beach itself in North Carolina. And economically, it is a loved product. And so now that the oyster industry is making a comeback, we see a lot of businesses, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that are really reclaiming this particular part of our North Carolina heritage and using it for marketing and promotion. And so the idea was that we could create a trail with this product with all sorts of stakeholders that might be interested in featuring this product and being a part of our trail. So, but what I'm really focused on is, again, who are our potential visitors who might actually want to come and visit this trail. So if we were asking people to buy into this trail and to be a member on our website, we wanted to be able to say that, well, you might actually have some business from being a part of this trail. And so what I'm presenting today is that demand. So in order to measure demand, we did a panel survey for our top markets in North Carolina using our state research, tourism research offices, what they say is our top tourism markets. And we were able to get completed 745 surveys. So what we did with the data that we collected was first do a cluster analysis so that we could understand who our market segments were in terms of their preferences for oyster consumption and experiences that they might have with the oyster. And so we also did follow-up ANOVA and chi-square analysis to look at significant differences in these profile elements, such as tour elements, preferences, travel preferences, where they got information about oysters, what they were willing to pay for different oyster experiences. But what I'm really focusing on today is the cluster analysis. If you want to know more about the ANOVAs and chi-square analysis, talk to me afterwards. We're working on a publication about this. So as you can see, our top markets for North Carolina in terms of our visitor markets really are focused in the Northeast to about the mid-Atlantic states. And we surveyed from 9 different states. So what did we end up finding? Well, there are 5 distinct types of consumers of oysters these are people that might come and consume oysters on the trail in North Carolina. So I'll talk about each one of these segments in depth, but I'll make a note that the oyster abstainer, these are the people that just are not that into oysters. I'm not going to really talk about them much, but if you want to know more, we can talk later. So I remember when Whitney and I were doing this cluster analysis and kind of coming up with names for the clusters. It was really exciting in trying to figure out, what's the right name to call a cluster. That's really important, especially from a marketing perspective and for our trail members to really convey, like, what are these people wanting to do when they come on the trail? So oyster source seekers, these are the people that want to actually have the whole sort of supply chain experience. Like, they want to come to the farm. It's not just about the oyster, it's about the environment, and it's also about the people itself that they're meeting along the way. So from a marketing perspective, we can actually translate that into saying, okay, there is some value in actually featuring stories about our local farmers, for example, on the North Carolina Oyster Trail website at some point. We also have oyster enthusiasts. These were my favorite people. Like, they're just oyster everything. We asked questions on a Likert scale from 1 to 5, and they were just 5s, which being, in support of everything. They would wear oyster jewelry, they'd go on an oyster tour, they would eat oysters every day of their life. So these are definitely low-hanging fruit from a marketing perspective. We also had oyster consumers. So these are a little bit different than your source seekers. So these folks are really just interested in the oyster. They're not going to be necessarily the people you want to target with the, emotional appeals and the backstories of, this is how the oyster was produced and this is the culture and the environment that it comes from. They're like, we want to have the best, the creme of the creme. We want, the best oysters that we can get. And that was actually really great information if you think about from a restaurant's perspective about who might actually come as sort of like a foodie, if you will, to come and enjoy this product. We also had oyster opportunists, and I have dice here because they're kind of like the gamblers, or they really will eat oysters if it's convenient. So they might consume oysters if they go to a seafood festival, but they're not necessarily going to go out of their way to include oysters as part of their dining experience while they're visiting our coastal areas. And so here's some key takeaways. And again, I really wanted to kind of focus on the marketing implications and how we actually can use this market research for us to further develop the North Carolina Oyster Trail. Right now, we do have an official website. Jane, you'll have to remind me how many members we have right now. We have 70 members, and the trail extends all the way from the coast all the way to the middle part of our state in North Carolina, which we call, from a geographic perspective, the Piedmont. So it's, do we? That's amazing. Okay, that's a new development. I did not know that. So that's incredible. North Carolina, if you're not familiar, takes about 7 to 9 hours to cross, depending on where you're coming from. So some key takeaways are that enthusiasts and consumers, they really want to meet the growers. And we do have quite a few growers that are members on our trail. And that was really exciting for us to learn, because when we think about I'll talk about in the next slide what we actually can do with this information to help our trail members actually see a return on investment, because they do pay to be a part of this trail, and to also be able to increase visibility. We can actually use this information to help them design experiences for visitors. Our enthusiasts, the source seekers, and the consumers, so all of these three segments enjoy oysters and consuming them. They do care about the destination's coastal lifestyle and access to local seafood. So regardless of whether someone was only interested in the oyster or they wanted the whole experience, they did care about local seafood. And so this session's about regenerative tourism. It's about, in a way, sustainable tourism. And so we do see a demand for local seafood. And I think that's an incredibly important message, not just for our oyster industry, but for the seafood industry in North Carolina as a whole. And then also we looked at information channels, like I mentioned in the first slide. And what was interesting is that all visitors, regardless of the segment, preferred websites, print, and word of mouth marketing over social media. Social media, whether we asked about Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all the outlets, none of our markets really cared about that, which I thought was really interesting to find. And then also the source seekers, enthusiasts, and consumers, all of them accepted a $150 price point for oyster experiences. So we asked a question where we basically laid out a scenario. We said, if you could go out on a boat, I forget how long we said the tour was, 2 hours. You can have like 4 to 6 people on this boat tour. And we gave them different price points, and $150 still people were willing to pay regardless of what market segment they were in. So again, that's really great information for our trail members as they're trying to package experiences for people who come and visit the trail. And that's right. So that was a minimum. And so we haven't even found out what the true cutoff point is on what people would be willing to pay. So I keep alluding to this, how is this research being used? And this is why I'm really excited to be a part of this project. So we are working with trail members. We've already presented some of this market data to them so they can start thinking about, okay, if I have an enthusiast and source seekers that are coming together in one group to come experience something on my oyster farm, how might I actually package that experience? I know I can charge more than $150, And then I know that the source seekers are probably going to only care about the oysters, right? So maybe I'm not going to focus so much on the whole story about myself. So there's lots of ways that you can package the experiences for the visitors to the trail. And then also the North Carolina Oyster Trail, this work started in 2019 and well, I guess we got the funding in 2019 and have continued to grow since then, but now it's time for strategic planning. So we've done this first round of sort of market analysis, and we're trying to figure out what's next. How do we continue to grow the trail? How is it self-sustaining? And, you know, what are its purposes moving forwards? And with that, that's the end of my presentation.
So we have about 20 minutes, so we can go to some questions. Now I'll start. There's a question that's posted online, so let me pull it up first. And this is for any of our panel members. So is it possible to do like the full screen so we can see all the different numbers that are online? And so the first question was actually from Ryan Stanley, and he asks, I wonder if any of the presenters have comment on utilizing regenerative principles to help with the transition from resource extraction focus in communities to tourism. So for BC, trying to move from that, you know, more heavy reliance on, you know, oil extraction and how can we move that to more of a tourism base? And the presenters want to comment on that? Yep.
Mark, I messaged Ryan a suggestion of someone that he might contact Sarah Breen at Selkirk. She's the regional chair for innovation and rural economic development. And Sarah's worked quite extensively with forestry-based communities. So she may have some insights to share about that kind of transition.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anyone in the room have any questions for our panelists or presenter? Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that stood out to me was that, you know, I tend to think about oysters in our modern era as being sort of a luxury product. The average household income wasn't necessarily that high across the clusters, except for I think the previous group. So I'm wondering if that was surprising to you at all, but also how much of that might attribute to the that perhaps this trail is most attractive to like auto-based tourists who are kind of looking for more budget, maybe not too far away types of trips.
So question is that's okay. One mic. So how is the trail really directed towards more of that budget tourist, or how do we capture them?
The income levels.
Based on income levels. Okay.
Yeah.
Emily, do you want to come up?
Yes.
Yeah. Everyone else is kind of mic'd here, so at least you can be mic'd here. And
It's fine. It's
yeah.
fine. Thank you.
No problem.
So that is an awesome question that I had not thought about yet. So I don't think we've talked about, I think in our heads, at least in my head, I was only thinking about maybe luxury travel, but you're right, that's not what our demographics reflect in terms of median household income. Whitney has a suggestion she wants to share.
Thanks for that question. I think with the income brackets with that might be something reflecting of the fact this is a panel survey and that we've got certain people in the population who respond to that. But I also think that you might think about how we sorted people with this. And we did ask a qualifying question if they had traveled to North Carolina within the 12 months, yes, right? 12 months. So we're looking at people who had traveled there, and within that sort of targeted area, we probably have a lot of people who fall within that sort of mid to somewhat upper level income, and that's probably being reflected from some of that filtering we did with Qualtrics. But we wanted to target that because we know those are the people who are likely coming to North Carolina, right? We wanted to go after those folks who were probably going to come anyway, and we're more of that low-hanging fruit than trying to get someone from like California or Washington to come out for the Oyster Trail. So I think that's what you're seeing there.
Yeah.
And there's, sorry, I was going to say there was something else that came to mind too, though, when you're talking about like automobile travelers or budget travelers. One thing that we did find, I don't know if y'all could see it in the demographics, was that 2 of our market segments actually reported on average having 2 to 3 kids, which was really interesting to me, and thinking about like there's sort of a younger population. So when you think about designing those experiences, for sure, you know, I was like, yeah, we have to think about liability. What do you do if you have a 3-year-old floating around on the boat with you looking at an oyster farm? That's a different sort of experience than, you know, if you're just sort of an empty nester that's going on these experiences as well. So when I think about income, I also was thinking about family size too, and when you brought up that question.
And this profile, that's the demand side, right? It doesn't mean it's supply well.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Thank you. Next question. Yes.
Since we're talking about the oyster show right now, what is the seasonality component? Is there a strong seasonality component for the oyster show right now, or is it pretty spread across?
So question is, what is the seasonality component for the Oyster Trail? Just repeating for everyone online.
Yeah, so I think, and you know, I think Jane, you might have a strong opinion on this, but in my opinion, I feel like the trail actually kind of helps with coastal seasonality in tourism. So typically we have the summer visitors that come to the coast, but the great thing about the trail is that we have everyone from restaurant owners to art galleries. I mean, anything that you could imagine, seafood markets. So that would be reasons for people to come to this part of North Carolina year round. And also there's seafood festivals that you know, I think are on the horizon, that where the trail is going to be present, and, you know, having booths to try to get and typically seafood festivals in North Carolina happen in the fall and sort of in off seasons as another way to kind of offset that seasonality. Mm-hmm. I can type here and say that.
And that's one of those things, Jane, I'm glad you mentioned about the year-round consumption of farmed oysters. A lot of people don't know that you can eat these grown oysters year-round, and that's part of this educational element for oysters as a product of North Carolina, that we want consumers to understand, you know, the adage of don't eat it with months that don't have an R, right? Like that, you can ignore that with grown oysters. And so that really helps increase that market demand for the oysters, which is great for our growers.
Cool. Thank you.
I actually had a follow-up statement to the initial question that was asked about the transition with regenerative tourism. And I think the oyster trail is a really good example of that, actually, because Jane, you were just talking in a presentation that we did for our Oyster Trail members a couple weeks ago about the decline in the harvest of wild oysters. We've seen significant declines in that, which, as Emily mentioned, was a really important cultural element for North Carolina. We're seeing a growth in the harvest of grown oysters, which is really good for our ecosystems in North Carolina. They provide a lot of ecosystem services, and obviously they bring these economic impacts. But the trail is a really important part of that, and the work that Jane has done with our partners in North Carolina to make tourism a viable product to support that oyster growth and all the ecosystem services that come along with that, I think is a really great example of regenerative tourism. And Jane is definitely the leader and the expert in this on how to bring together partners from different elements, whether it's the growers, whether it's the wild harvest folks, whether it's the restaurants, to make this a viable product. So I think she's done a really great job of making the Oyster Trail an example of something that we can use in that regenerative context. So
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Any questions online? I'll get some more in the room, just see if there's any here.
Can I ask a question? I have my questions.
Oh yeah, if you have a question, go ahead.
So Danielle, I was doing a bunch of Googling while you were presenting, and I saw that the deadline for submitting feedback on the federal tourism growth strategy is July 20th. Are you going to submit feedback?
I encourage all Canadians to submit feedback if they'd like to have some feedback. And I thought, Chloe, your slide that was talking about like the role of business leadership in encouraging government to consider things like the regenerative role tourism can have and that potential is really critical, because, you know, in other research and probably in other people's experience, that's been kind of the culture of policymaking, that business needs to give government permission to actually talk about things that businesses already doing. You know, they're like, we're not waiting for government. You can see all these examples of regenerative tourism, but there seems to be a disconnect, and there's some potential lost and not kind of connecting the pieces together.
Thank you. Yeah.
I guess related to that, I have a question.
Okay.
In working in the past with state and national, even level strategic plans, there's something, you know, you did an analysis of whether it exists or not. Do you know, is there information on what, you know, the sins of omission versus sins of commission? And do people go out of their way and not include sustainability in the plans because they are the political ramifications for that? Because I have experience with that as someone who's worked with state level organizations where it was taken out and we put the recommendations and it's taken out. Do you have that, or do you think it's just people are?
Did you hear the question, Danielle? No. So yeah. So the question is, you know, is there a I think there's a rationale for why certain key terms like sustainability are left out of these policy documents? And
I don't
it's
know.
politically motivated, right?
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't comment definitively. I guess I was a bit surprised. The 2011 document was under a conservative government. The 2019 was under a liberal government. You know, just as a anecdotal, you know, what's your sense? I would have thought I would see more sustainability in the liberal version and not the conservative one, but that's not how it appears when you do an analysis. So, you know, I don't know who directed the process or who was, you know, minister of what at the various times. I haven't quite got into that context yet, but it doesn't connect to like political ideology in any obvious way.
Okay. 3 last questions, I think. So we'll go 1, 2, 3. So first question. Yeah, come up to the mic. Then it makes it easier.
Hi, thank you all for the beautiful presentations. I enjoyed it. The question that I have, first time I heard the term regenerative tourism was in like after COVID, I guess, like when COVID happened. And when you were presenting on the document analysis, the content analysis, I started playing with my phone, Google Scholar searching of the term regenerative tourism to see when was the first time it was used in academic environment. And the earliest article I found was in 2020. The document you analyzed was 2019. So did you do any sort of like content analysis of scholar works or non-scholar works to see when was the earliest time that was used? Because I thought that maybe the term was regenerative tourism was generated maybe around that time, 2019.
I feel like it sort of took off around that time, but it was being used in industry already. I think there might be other presenters who could comment more about like that regenerative tourism organization website it predates COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know that. I just had the question.
Yeah, I think maybe someone else wants to comment more on that history of that term in particular, but I think it took off with COVID, but I think it predates COVID.
Go ahead, Emily. Yeah, there's 2 more. Okay. So next question.
Yeah, so kind of your question there for
come on up. Yeah.
Hi, so kind of piggybacking off of that question for Danielle here, but also maybe this could come up for Chloe as well. Do you think because you were examining a federal document, you weren't seeing these terms come up, and you might see these terms come up more if you're looking at a provincial or more of a regional planning document instead? Or have you not had a chance to do that sort of?
Yeah, I have in prior research looked at provincial and regional documents. And in that case, in BC, I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, but there was a plan in maybe 2018 or 19 that had the environment, it had concepts like regeneration, it was really focused on cultural, social, environmental benefits in communities. And that was a real shift with political change when the NDP directed that process. And it was very starkly different from an earlier plan that was very focused on economic growth. So in that case, it was kind of clear to me that there had been a political change. But I think the use, at least of sustainability, and definitely our regional DMO is all over regeneration. And they were in that, like that discourse was happening regionally before it happened provincially. And if you talk to people in kind of regional DMOs, at least in the Thompson Okanagan, it came from local, it came from initiatives like the Oyster Trail that kind of fed up to regional DMOs that fed up to the provinces and look, this is what we're doing. This is a strategic direction we want to go. But there's lots of issues with provincial and federal, it's not all in alignment.
Yeah, I work in BC as well, and there is a bit of a disconnect. There seems to be between even the regional, the provincial, and the federal level. So it's interesting to get that policy analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's check time. Yep. So let's go for a last question.
More of a response to one of the chat, people in the chat questions. I think it relates to everybody. I think Ralph had mentioned in the chat just kind of regenerative travel and like consumptive forest products, or what was it? Let's see. Yeah, from resource extraction communities. I think when you think about regenerative travel, you really need to like tie it back to the history of these communities and the industries of the area. So there might be extractive industries in your area, but if you kind of ostracize those people and you say like you're the bad guys and like try to go tourism in a different direction, that's not going to be regenerative. Like the Oyster Trail is great because it pulls from the oyster heritage of North Carolina and kind of flips it where now tourists are consuming that and kind of supporting that traditional form of agriculture. You know, if you say that, hey, logging's bad, mining's bad, whatnot's bad, let's go a new tourism thing, then it's not really regenerating anything. You're bringing in these outsiders with different values into the community, and then you're going to create a lot of conflict with the residents. So I think that helps with the sustainable development goals and a lot of other people's presentations. So,
yeah, thank you. So we actually do have a couple more minutes if I have another question. No? Yeah, go ahead, Emily. I don't see any more questions, so go ahead, Emily. Come on up. Yeah.
I wrote this down earlier. So this question is for Natasha. I'm fascinated to learn about BIAs. This is honestly, it sounds very similar to like Chamber of Commerce's or perhaps our Main Street development organizations in the US. And I'm wondering if you had seen any specific successful collaborations between a BIA and a DMO. Like, was there, for example, did they share financial resources for a particular marketing initiative, or like were there other resources that were shared? Because like I understand conceptually that they can collaborate, but I'm more interested now in like the nitty-gritty of how that looks and how that works.
Yeah, a couple examples came up. One was like one of the BIAs would look at the marketing that their DMO was doing, and they would kind of work together on trying to align that message. Because like they were saying, when a visitor is looking at that message, it's not like they're looking at, okay, this is the DMO message and this is the BIA message. It's kind of, to them, it's one and the same. So just trying to align that. But then also there was a good example of a BIA that collaborated with their DMO on an event, because what they were finding was in this community, tourism was very seasonal. And so they would have a huge number of visitors in the summer, and then in the winter, there would be nothing. And so they collaborated to work on that. And so they did a winter festival that was like a lights festival. And so they did that in collaboration with the DMO to try and address like the seasonality issues. So those were a couple examples that came to mind.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank all of our presenters for coming today and providing a great perspective. It's been really interesting to kind of get that global perspective. We got a national perspective, we got a local perspective, and then actually a case perspective. So it's nice to really have that broad understanding in just one session. So thank you all for coming today and presenting and sharing your work with us. And if we can give them one last round of applause, just as a thank you.